we will talk politics. Brigitte Morten is with us. Neale Jones, I think, is just coming into the studio as we speak. Here he comes. So we'll talk politics in the meantime while we wait for the press conference from the police. Brigitte Morten is director with public and commercial law firm Franks Ogilvie, former senior ministerial advisor for the previous National-led government, National Party member, also currently volunteering for the party's deputy leader, Nicola Willis, and Neale Jones, Chief of Staff to Labour Leader Jacinda Ardern, also Chief of Staff to Andrew Little and a Director of Public Affairs firm, Capital. Morena, welcome both of you.
Morena.
Let's start with the Tamaki Makaurau by-election. Brigitte, start with you. Orini Kaipara, the big winner on the night. Were you surprised at the scale of the win?
Yeah, absolutely. I think she almost got 2 votes every one that her opponent got. So I think that was a significant vote for her. But I do think if you dig under those results, though, that they are probably not as positive for either party, for either Labour or Te Pāti Māori. Obviously, a really low turnout. So I looked back the Port Waikato by-election, which happened just after, the last election, which probably was the least needed by-election we've ever had. And there was still turnout there of 35%, but whereas only saw about 27% on Saturday. And that follows quite a significant change into the Māori electoral role and big Te Pāti Māori activations, that big hikoi. You would have thought that there would have been bigger turnout in that election. So I think that was really surprising, and it's probably, whilst they got the great result on the night, for Te Pāti Māori thinking about next year, they probably need to think a little bit about how they turn their voters out.
Neale, what's your comment on this? Because I guess Peeni Henare would have been hoping to get that seat back for Labour.
Yeah, it was a pretty devastating result for Labour and for Peeni. I mean, Peeni worked really hard. He ran, by all accounts, a very good straight-down-the-line campaign. Both sides, I understand, thought it was going to be right down to the wire like it was at the election. And I think everyone was quite shocked on election night, as was I, sitting in my living room refreshing the election results website, seeing that 2-1 margin. Look, I think there are, like Brigitte says, there are some factors here. I don't think turnout would have changed the actual result, but it may have changed the margin. I think there was probably a bit of sympathy there, the previous MP having died under very sad circumstances. And I think Māori voters are traditionally very strategic, and so would have seen you've got Peeni Henare already in Parliament, we'll bring someone new in, and you sort of get 2 for 1, and that's always been a strong message in those Māori seats. But I also think, probably more worryingly for Labour is I think Te Pāti Māori kind of has the vibe at the moment. I think they've, as Brigitte mentioned with those activations they had, particularly around the Treaty Principles Bill, I think for a lot of voters who've chosen to go on the Māori roll, who are, I think, entirely justifiably angry at this government, which is undermining Māori in every way it can. I think if you're angry at this government, you probably look at Te Pāti Māori and say they're going to be a champion to, take my anger to Parliament more than Labour right now, which, Labour's Māori MPs did a lot in the previous government. They've got a great track record to sit on, but they look a lot more like the status quo right now, I think.
Do you think that's fair, Brigitte?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can see the frustrations of, senior MPs like Willie Jackson with that sort of result on Saturday night, because ultimately this puts Chris Hipkins in a difficult position. They would want to win at least a couple of those seats back, I think, from Te Pāti Māori at next year's election. But at the moment, they're also trying to win back that middle ground, and they don't want to be pulled too far to the left towards Te Pāti Māori, whilst also trying to play the middle ground. So I think it's going to be really hard for them to juggle that going into next year. And you sort of saw some of the commentary coming through from Peeni all the way through that he was really trying to toe that line very carefully about speaking out for Māori, but also knowing that the wider electorate was listening.
And I guess maybe turnout aside, it will be an endorsement for Te Pāti Māori for a lot of the work that they have been doing, a lot of the reach that they have been trying to get on things like social media, when they have had an MP returned in that seat for their party. Yes, not a big turnout, but seemingly a big vote of confidence for them, do you think?
Yeah, ultimately it is an endorsement of the fact that they, had that voice, I think, as was being said. So I think without a doubt they should be celebrating it, but it does change that dynamic, particularly between potential coalition partners, being Labour and Te Pāti Māori going into next year, and about how they split that vote, and maybe this is some time for some strategic conversations about who is going after what particular votes.
Yeah, and I think it does create a challenge for Labour, because had Labour won this by-election, Chris Hipkins could have more easily batted away questions about what he's going to do about Te Pāti Māori and said, look, we're going to try and win all 7 Māori seats, we may not even have to deal with them. Now it looks like the Te Pāti Māori's on the ascendance, and it's much harder to make that argument. And so I do think for Te Pāti Māori, I mean, they're doing a very good job at growing their vote, but they probably do need to, in my view, have a bit of a think about how are we going to change the government? Because if you're Te Pāti Māori, you want to get rid of this government.
You're listening to 9 to Noon, and we're talking politics at the moment with our commentators Neale Jones and Brigitte Morten. Where to jump back in on this now, having had that news?
Yeah, look, I was just reflecting that perhaps following this result and looking at election year ahead, I think it's quite clear that National and Acting New Zealand First will look to use the idea of Te Pāti Māori being scary as a way to scare middle voters away from Labour. If you're Te Pāti Māori, you obviously have to be unapologetically Māori, you have to try and maximise your vote, but it might be worth thinking about how to work with Labour to find a way to have language you can both use that can put people's minds at ease a bit, because ultimately Te Pāti Māori wants to knock this government out and they want to stop attacks on Māori, and that means not becoming a distraction in the election campaign, which is a tough conversation to have, but I think it's probably one they need to start thinking about.
Brigitte, do you think this is the kind of strategising that will be likely to succeed, that will, that you will see, I guess, a more united front being put forward, not just on the left of politics, but potentially on the right of politics, looking, I suppose, to the New Zealand First Conference that just took place as well?
Yeah, I think Neale is absolutely right that the coalition will look to look at the chaos, I think, of a potential Greens Te Pāti Māori Labour government. And you saw that strongly in the New Zealand First Conference on the weekend. Winston Peters made that very clear, that he thought that would be a disaster. I think one of the things I think you have seen in this coalition is actually a really good stabilisation of that agree to disagree principle. And for the most part, it has actually worked pretty calmly. The coalition has been pretty stable. I think that is what Labour should look for, I think, going forward. I think it's more difficult because you have Te Pāti Māori is a different kind of party, I think, than the ACT Party. And I would be really interested to see whether or not that's something in terms of disciplines they can apply. I think you just need to look at last week in Te Kuta Where's post about the fact that non-Māori were trying to steal a Māori seat, which was completely off message from what their leader had been saying just days before. And then I understand also probably made a social media post on election day as well that's been looked into by the Electoral Commission.
Okay. On the New Zealand First Conference, Neale, did it provide some of the classic Winston Peters talking points?
I mean, yes, he talked about immigration. He talked about immigrants signing up to values. He talked about, retirement savings. He talked about which toilets different people use, which seems to be one of his favourite things to talk about lately. And he launched broadsides against the woke, in inverted commas. So it was a classic Winston speech. I thought, while I disagreed with about 80% of what he said, I thought that he gave quite a coherent narrative about New Zealand First, its role in the coalition, and he's clearly trying to dig into Labour's working class base. You can see he's looking to Farage in the UK, who has managed to overtake both Labour and the Tories, and if an election were held tomorrow, would likely be Prime Minister. And Trump in the US, of course, who's taken a lot of the Democrats' working class base. So he'll be he's quite clearly looking at that. Stuart Nash coming in as a speaker was.
I wanted to talk to you about Stuart Nash because how much of the surprise was it? I'm
not surprised. I mean, Stu's been on a journey since he left Parliament, and I like Stu. I'm not going to criticise him. I've worked with him, over a number of years. But I disagree with his analysis. He went there and said, look. New Zealand First has taken on the mantle of Fraser and Savage, and it's the new party for the working class. I don't think Fraser and Savage would join the board of the Taxpayers Union, and I don't think they would join a party that single-handedly destroyed fair pay agreements in its term of office. So I think that analysis is wrong, but, I think for New Zealand First to get someone like Stuart Nash on board, that's not unhelpful for them. I think Stu was very valuable in Labour's caucus. You wouldn't want a whole caucus of Stuart Nashes, but I thought having one or two was very useful if you want to be a broad tent. But yeah, I think New Zealand First is clearly angling for that working class vote, and hoping they can sort of frame Labour as being, woke and divisive and focused on race. In Winston's speech, he did a whole spiel about Labour being woke, and then said they should be focusing on things like health and jobs and housing, which is actually exactly what Labour's focusing on. So I think he's creating a caricature of the Labour Party that kind of fits his sort of Facebook boomer memes, but I don't think it actually reflects reality. I think he'll have a much tougher job than, say, Farage or Trump have had.
Bridget, what did the Stuart Nash unveiling, if that's the right word, turning up at the New Zealand First Conference say to you about that broader appeal that perhaps Winston Peters is trying to dig into?
Yeah, I mean, we know that Winston Peters is one of the smartest political operators out there, and Stuart Nash does have a strong regional following in Napier in particular, in that sort of area. So in terms of New Zealand First being able to attract more of that regional vote, and if he was to campaign there, I think he would be, a big asset for them. Obviously, on current polling, there's no way that Stuart Nash could come back in with the Labour Party, nor does there seem to be any appetite for it. So it's unsurprising that I think that he's looked for other options. Interestingly, he did speak quite strongly against Hipkins as leader, and I think that follows Winston Peters' narrative of sort of saying he would not be in a coalition with a Hipkins-led Labour Party. So that does kind of draw us the lines, I think, even more strongly that next year is going to be a battle of the coalitions. It's going to be, New Zealand First with National and ACT, as opposed to maybe New Zealand First being in that kingmaker or choosing to kind of keep their powder dry going into the election.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting looking at New Zealand First language around Labour. I mean, Winston clearly is, to his supporters, framing Labour up as part of kind of a woke trio who are threatening everything good that New Zealand stands for. I think, whereas in previous elections he has been more careful to leave his options open, I think it would be very hard for him to go with Labour after this election.
But this brings us, I suppose, to something else to talk about. There's been a lot of talk about Christopher Luxon and how much pressure he is coming under as leader of the National Party. But does that also indicate that perhaps it will not be the two Chris's that go into the next election? As much leaders.
As I'd love to come here and make bold predictions about Luxon being rolled, I think it's premature. It's a very tall order to roll a sitting Prime Minister, in their first term after they've taken a party to victory. I think you'd need to see sustained low polling. I mean, the latest Roy Morgan had National on 29, though I don't put much stock in Roy Morgan. If you had a number of polls showing National sliding to the 20s, maybe that's when the backbenchers start to worry that, marginal seats or list spots won't get them there. But I think unless you start to see sustained low polling, I think people will look at it and say, the economy might improve once Labour starts having to announce policy, starts having to talk about its coalition options. Maybe that gets harder for them. I just don't see Luxon being rolled right now.
Bridget?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think this is a classic issue of where the press gallery loves a leadership coup, but most New Zealand, and we know that's reflected in the polls and in the voting, don't love leadership changes. They want stability. They want politicians talking about the things that matter to them, not talking about themselves. So whilst I think there's a lot of frustration expressed in the community about Luxon, a lot of it is tied to the economy and where the economy's going. So Neale is right to say that, people would be holding out hopes that the economy is going to start pointing more in the right direction. I think if you look at those unfavourability polls too, you've essentially got Hipkins and Luxon on about the same. Luxon kind of sits a little bit ahead most of the time, but mostly the same. So if you're going to a head-to-head on leaders, you don't really have a strong leadership contest going into next year. It is going to be much more on what the parties are delivering, what is the record, I think what is the potential coalitions.
The one thing I will say about Luxon, though, is he's never been popular. He's never been a popular leader if you compare him to other previous ones. And I think a lot of people voted for him not because they liked him, but because the economy was stuffed, they were sick of Labour, and they thought this is a business guy who's promising to get the economy going and reduce the cost of living. That promise hasn't been delivered, and if the economy doesn't pick up... And
running out of runway.
Yeah, and I think if the economy doesn't pick up and people don't start to feel that, that's when he's in real danger, from a public perspective at least.
I suppose we should also as well talk a little bit about Benjamin Doyle's resignation. Interesting coming, of course, just before the New Zealand First conference, when it was Winston Peters that had first, I guess, brought that to people's notice. Bridget, what do you think this says about the situation that MPs are increasingly coming under?
Yeah, well, without a doubt, there has been increased security concerns for MPs, and we saw that particularly rise during Jacinda Ardern's term. Horrific, I think, some of those threats that were made against her and her family. But that has become a little bit of the state of the norm, unfortunately. I think in this particular circumstance, this is awful that Benjamin Doyle did face this level of threat, and I think for most people they weren't aware that this was going on throughout this time. It was an issue that was in the politics, 3-4 months ago, not really something that's discussed now. So it would come as a surprise. I do think, though, the Greens did mishandle this issue. In what way? In the way that they came out with no responsibility taken by Benjamin Doyle for what I think 95% of New Zealand saw as inappropriate comments made around, or terminology used around, children in social media posts. And they also made claims that this was very common within the queer community, whereas many within that community said absolutely not. This is not what they would stand for. So I think the Greens and Benjamin Doyle could have handled that differently. In no way does that mean that these threats were at all legitimate, but I do think it's a lesson in actually making sure that you are responsible for your actions and are aware of how it'll come across to other people.
Neale?
Yeah, the Greens didn't handle the Benjamin Doyle issue well at the time, but as Brigitte says, regardless, the threats were completely inappropriate, and the character defamation of them was inappropriate as well. I do think this is something we need to come down really hard on, this kind of abuse of politicians, and I say this not because I want to protect politicians from accountability. I say it because we see where this goes in the US. I mean, over there you've had Nancy Pelosi's, home raided and her husband attacked. We've seen a US politician was killed. Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania's house was set on fire. Words do lead to violence, and when that happens, your democracy breaks down. And our democracy is under threat from so many things right now. I do think that kind of abuse discourages good people, and it also can lead to more.
Thank you very much, both of you. Neale Jones and Brigitte Morten there are political commentators this morning on 9 to Noon.